Today we're diving into a story that is honestly just as heartbreaking as it is completely maddening. It's a story of profound institutional betrayal, and to really understand it, we need to look at it directly through the eyes of Courtney Wild. Courtney was a victim of Jeffrey Epstein. She was abused by him from the time she was just 14 years old, all the way until she was 17. But what we're looking at today isn't just about the crime itself, as horrific as that is. It's really about the massive systemic failure that came after. We're going to break down how the legal mechanisms that were explicitly designed to protect her, and dozens of others, by the way, completely fell apart, and how a law meant to be a shield for victims was rendered entirely powerless. I really want you to take a second and just let the sheer weight of these words sink in. What happened to me was terrible, but what happened after that by our own government changed my life just as much. That is Courtney's exact quote. The initial abuse was a horrific trauma, absolutely. But what she makes so incredibly clear here is that the secondary trauma, the trauma inflicted by the exact justice system that was supposed to protect her, was equally life-altering. Behind closed doors, the government literally sat down and signed a secret non-prosecution agreement with her abuser. They negotiated away her one shot at justice completely behind her back. I mean, just imagine surviving what she went through, only to find out the government effectively protected the predator instead of you. And really, that brings us to the silence and the betrayal of it all. Courtney actually filed a case under the Crime Victims' Rights Act specifically because the government was actively keeping her and the other victims completely in the dark. Picture this. You're Courtney, you're opening your mail, and you're reading these official letters from the government telling you to just be patient. You're sitting there believing there's this active, ongoing investigation meant to protect you, but meanwhile, the government already knew the case was over. The deal was already signed and sealed. For years, she believed the system was working for her, only to realize that the silence was actually just a cover-up for a done deal. It's honestly mind-boggling when you look at the contrast and how the government handled the two sides here. On one hand, you've got the government and Epstein's high-powered lawyers actively negotiating, seemingly putting all their energy into making sure a billionaire predator was happy with his punishment. And then on the other side, you have the victims, kept in the dark, totally ignored, just told to be patient. For Courtney, this was an absolute shock to the system. I mean, where she comes from, if you commit a crime, you go to jail. Simple as that. The very idea that a criminal could just sit down with federal prosecutors and ask, hey, are we cool with how much time I'm going to serve, was completely alien to her. It was literally a dual system of justice staring her right in the face. Now, when Courtney finally realized what was actually going on, she could have just walked away. A lot of people would have, but she didn't. She decided to fight back against the very institutions that were supposed to protect her, and that kicked off this grueling, decade-long legal battle just to get basic answers. She needed to know how something like this could even happen in the United States justice system. She wanted to do the right thing, not just for herself, but for all the victims, together. But man, getting those answers, it was going to require an unimaginable amount of endurance. Let's look at how this actually played out. In 2008, lawyer Brad Edwards took Courtney's case. But if you think this was some quick legal fix, think again. It took years of intense, exhausting litigation. They had to fight all the way up to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals for one reason, just to force the government to hand over the emails between the prosecutors and Epstein's lawyers. And those emails, they were the smoking gun that finally proved the government was prioritizing Epstein's comfort over the victim's legal rights. And get this, it wasn't until 2019, over 10 years after she started this fight, that a federal judge finally ruled on the case. A full decade of her life, just battling the government to uncover the truth. Which leads us perfectly to the law at the very center of this whole mess, the Crime Victims' Rights Act. So this is a federal law, and its explicit purpose is to protect victims and guarantee them specific rights, like the right to actually be reasonably heard and conferred with during a case. Fast forward to 2019, and the federal judge looks at it all and agrees with Courtney. The court officially states that yes, the government violated the law and violated the victim's rights by making that secret deal. Sounds like a massive victory, right? Well, actually, scratch that. It wasn't. Because in the very same breath, the judge concluded that despite this blatant violation, there was no remedy. The law was broken, but absolutely nothing could be done to fix it. So it all boils down to this one crucial question that Courtney had to grapple with. What on earth is a law actually worth if there are zero consequences for breaking it? I really want you to think about that for a second. This was Courtney's agonizing realization. If a federal court can look at a case, explicitly state, yep, the government definitely violated this law, but then just shrug their shoulders and say, but hey, nothing happens as a result, then the law doesn't matter. A law with no consequences doesn't protect anybody.
It is literally just ink on paper. And look, for Courtney and the other survivors, we aren't just talking about some theoretical academic legal debate here. The failure of this law has a devastating real-world cost. When the government fails to enforce the Crime Victims' Rights Act, and when an abuser gets a sweetheart deal that totally bypasses real justice, well, that abuser doesn't just go home and quietly retire. They don't just stop. The ripple effects of this kind of institutional failure, they're measured in human lives.
40. Let that number sink in. There were at least 40 kids in Palm Beach whose rights were systematically violated by the government during this secret backroom deal. 40 victims whose voices were completely silenced while Courtney was desperately fighting in court, literally begging the government for answers. That is 40 lives permanently impacted, all because the system chose to accommodate a wealthy predator instead of just following its own laws. And then we hit 2009. This is the year Epstein was actually released after serving his minimal, highly negotiated slap-on-the-wrist sentence. And here is the tragic, frankly infuriating irony of this entire timeline. While Courtney was spending years of her youth fighting in court, locked in this intense litigation with the government, Epstein was free. Because of his secret deal, he got out in 2009 and went right back to it, abusing countless more girls in New York, New Mexico, internationally, and right back down in Florida. Everybody knew he was a registered sex offender, but nothing was done until 2019. If the government hadn't violated Courtney's rights in the first place, if Epstein had been thrown in federal prison like any other criminal, there wouldn't have been a single victim after 2009.
It truly is a system that just keeps failing over and over. So let's fast forward to 2019. Epstein is finally arrested again. And Courtney was there for his bail hearing. She stood right there in federal court, looking right at him and spoke directly to the judge about exactly how dangerous this man was. And for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like the system actually worked. Bail was denied. Courtney finally felt like after all these years, they might actually get to see a trial. But then, barely a month later, the system fails one last, permanent time. Epstein was allowed to die in a secure federal prison. Somebody let him die, ensuring that he would permanently evade accountability for what he did to Courtney when she was just a kid. No trial, no final verdict, just another massive failure. But here's the thing. Courtney's story absolutely does not end with defeat. She didn't sacrifice a decade of her life fighting just for this to become some sad true crime story or a neat little political talking point. She fought so that the very next victim wouldn't have to suffer the exact same betrayal she did. Now, since Epstein's death, sure, there have been prosecutions of accomplices, civil cases, payouts, but none of that changes what was lost. And more importantly, none of that fixes the gaping legal loophole that allowed this whole nightmare to happen in the first place. So we really have to look at how we fix this now.
So how do we translate all of this into concrete, no-nonsense legislative solutions, while Courtney and her legal team have laid out exactly what needs to change in the Crime Victims' Rights Act? First up, we need a crystal clear legal definition of what it actually means to meaningfully confer with victims, so prosecutors can't just mail out deceptive please be patient letters and call it a day. Second, and this is huge, there have to be automatic consequences and penalties when a court finds a victim's rights have been violated. The answer can never again be, oh well, nothing happens. Third, if prosecutors decide to ignore victims, those victims' voices must be memorialized and preserved on the official record, especially during these closed-door plea deals. And finally, an attorney's fees provision. Victims need to be able to actually afford lawyers who will stand up to the federal government for them. These aren't crazy demands. They are logical, absolutely necessary steps to finally give this law some teeth.
So it leaves us with this. Are we finally going to make the Crime Victims' Rights Act actually matter? Or are we just going to sit around and wait for the system to fail the next victim? Courtney Wild endured years of horrific abuse, and that was followed by over a decade of fighting her own government just to prove they broke their own rules. Fixing the CVRA is the only real way to ensure that those decades of fighting weren't in vain. The blueprint is sitting right there. Now the system just has to step up and act on it.